Well, I got a question for you as we launch into this session. If you were going to write a mission statement of your responsibility to the next generation, what would it say? So if you're going to capture in one statement what you believe your role as a grandparent, as a parent, as a pastor, just as an adult in the church, as you look at the generation coming behind you, what would it say? I teach at Biola University now. The past 10 years, I was full-time in Christian education, teaching high school, and I'd ask my students a lot of questions, trying to get an insight into what they're thinking. And one question I'd ask my students all the time is I'd say, more than anything else, what do your parents or grandparents want for you? You know the most common answer I get from Christian kids? My parents just want me to be happy or successful. Now, do you want your grandkids and your kids to be happy and successful? Of course, I sure do. But is the purpose of raising up a generation behind us to raise up a generation of people who are happy? I would much rather have my kids be miserable and following the Lord than happy and walking away. I had a student come in not too long ago, just great kid, came in to talk. He sat down. He looked really frantic, like something was going on. He was bothered. And I said, what's going on? He said, gosh, last night I had a conversation with my dad, and I don't know what to do. My dad looked at me and said he would pay my way all the way through college and all the way through medical school. And then he was silent. I said, what's the problem? That sounds like a pretty good deal. He said, I don't want to be a doctor. My dad thinks it looks good for him to have a son who's a doctor, and he looks at me as his future nest egg. Now look, this father loves his son, I don't doubt that. But he had a certain perspective and view of the next generation that shaped the way he related to him and the choices he made about his future. My question is, what is your mission statement? Because as I look in the Bible, I see a very different one than I see often passed around in Christian circles today. In fact, in Psalms 127:4, it says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. That we are to look at the next generation coming behind us, to be warriors for the kingdom of God when you and I are no longer here. Now, when we think about it that way, that changes and transforms the way we look at young people, doesn't it? Young people are the greatest resource God has given us in the church. And they face more challenges by far than you and I came remotely close to facing when we were growing up. The question is, how on earth do we do this? I'm glad you asked, because that's exactly what we're going to look at. This morning, afternoon, whatever you call 11:30. What do you call 11:30? Is it still morning? Like I said, morning. We're going to take a look in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, if you want to turn there, that's fine. If you can't find it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Deuteronomy. I'll throw it up on the screen in a minute, but first, remember the context of Deuteronomy. This is written by Moses. He spent 40 years of his life shepherding the people, the Israelites, who had been in slavery in Egypt. They come out, that generation's unfaithful, so they die in the desert, and Moses shepherds the next generation up to the promised land. But Moses cannot go in because of his unfaithfulness. And the book of Deuteronomy, I love it because it's wisdom from somebody speaking his last words to those following him, how they can be successful in the land. Because think of the transformation these people are about to experience. They're no longer going to have, like you see behind me, pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day, telling them exactly where to go. They're going to move into a land that was built on very different principles than the principles they've gotten directly from God. They're going to live in buildings they didn't build and eat from crops they didn't plant. The question is, how do they remain faithful to God when they move into a nation that has principles that goes against the nation they learned? Now, I think our nation was founded on biblical principles, but it sounds like what they faced then is exactly what we face today, doesn't it? I don't think our culture is post-Christian. I think our culture in America is officially anti-Christian. And we better take some wisdom from the Word of God for the sake of the generation coming behind us. Well, let's take a look in Deuteronomy chapter 6. We'll be in chapter 6. If you can't find it, it's right after chapter 5. Starts off and Moses says, "This is the command, the statutes and ordinances the Lord your God has instructed me to teach you." So Moses is standing up in front of 2 to 3 million people. And although you and I know all of the Bible comes from God, occasionally the writers remind us that they are just the conduit, so to speak, through which God speaks to the people. So Moses is passing on to us what the God, creator of the universe, had given to him. That's the source of what we're reading. Verse 2 says, "Do this so you may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life. By keeping all his statutes and commands I'm giving you, your son, and your son's son, or your grandson, so you may have a long life." You know what's interesting when I read this? Is that he wasn't just interested in the generation that was going into Israel. And it wasn't just about their kids, and it wasn't about their grandkids. Who was Moses talking to? All the generations that would come because of whether or not this generation would be faithful. You see the power of what he's saying? Sometimes maybe we think of our lives as the number of years that God has given us and then we're gone. But the Jews thought of their lives as just being faithful for the period of time that God had given them, because their choices would resonate for generation after generation after generation. Amen. That's how powerful our choices are and how important it is that we follow the Lord. I've seen this in particular in my father's life. Now, I know many of you have told me you've read his books and met him and heard him speak, and he's been an apologist for years, but many people don't know my dad's story. So my dad grew up in a small town in Michigan, and his dad was the town drunk. My dad never saw his father sober until my dad was in his 20s. My dad's older sister committed suicide because of the pain of the family they grew up in. My dad was actually sexually abused for 7 years by a man who worked on the farm. And he tried to tell his mom, and she said, "Don't say such things. Go get a branch, and I'm going to give you a thrashing." He said it was the loneliest day of his life. I heard stories about how painful it was for my dad growing up, and I'm not sure I got it until our family was sitting around maybe a year ago, and my mom, who's from Boston, was telling funny stories of where she grew up, and my sister Heather, who's 10 years younger than I am, turns to my dad and goes, "Hey, Dad, share a funny story, a good memory you have when you were a kid." Awkward silence. My dad looks at his kids, he says, "You know what? I don't have one good memory." I just sat there and I wept. I thought, oh my goodness. By all sociological standards, my dad should be in prison, he should be dead, or he should be a terrorist or a drug dealer, or just wrecking the world. But God got a hold of my dad's heart, and he transformed him. And you know, my dad has spoken to more young people alive than anybody in world history. He's written 100 and some books. But if you ask my dad what's most significant to him, I don't think he'll say that. He'll say, "My son and my 3 daughters are following the Lord. And my 9 grandkids are following the Lord." Just the power. It's not because maybe my dad is famous and has a big name, but it's that we are faithful just in the small or big ways that God has given us. And that echoes for generations. That's the context Moses gives when he speaks to people about the next generation. Now keep in mind, this passage, by the way, before we look at it, we'll start at verse 4, is called the Shema. It's arguably the central passage of the entire Old Testament. Orthodox Jews repeat this passage today, still at least 2 times every single day. When Jesus was asked, "What's the greatest commandment in the law?" while answering, he quotes this passage from the Old Testament. So it's a very central, important passage. And in verse 4, Moses, he says, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one." You'll see it coming up on the screen. He says, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one." And I think there's a principle we learn about this right away. It's to make God the Lord of your home. Make God the Lord of your home. Because something is Lord of your life, something is Lord of your home. And the question is, what is it? Have you ever sent a message, maybe a text message or an email, and the moment you hit send, you wish you could reach in cyberspace and have it back? I was on a plane not too long ago, and I looked ahead and was one of my good friends on the same flight. I didn't know it, so I thought I'll text him. So I texted him. I said, "Hey, punk, turn around. I'm right behind you." And I sent it to my mom. Who was home alone at night reading. My mom texted me back. She said, "Hey, son, I think you've got the wrong punk." So I took notes. I said, note to self, don't call my mom a punk. Darn it, right? Well, the funny thing, the reason I tell you that is about 3 or 4 years ago, I had my first public debate with this outspoken atheist he's a PhD, but at a public school in town where I live. And he was sued because in a court of law, a Christian kid recorded him under the desk and deemed that what he said was disparaging against Christianity. Well, I debated this guy at a local college, and shortly before it, I got an email from a girl asking to interview me for the newspaper. I said, sure. But then a couple days later, shortly after, I get another email from her. I'm reading it through thinking, why on earth is she sharing this with me? Like depression and anger and rebellion. And then I realized she didn't mean to send it to me. So she comes over for the interview. And the interview is done. She's about to leave. I thought, you know what? Maybe she was supposed to send it to me in some divine sense. I said, you know what? You copied me on this email. I didn't realize it wasn't to me until I read it halfway through. But it sounds like you're dealing with some heavy stuff. I said, I'm not a counselor, but man, don't bury this stuff inside. What's going on? She said, you're right. Anger, rebellion. She went on. She was upset. She said, in fact, I was in church this past Sunday. But what my parents don't know is I've completely left the faith. I said, well, what's at the root of it? What's going on? She said, you really want to know? She said, here's what it is. She said, my dad is a workaholic. My dad works all day, every day. He'd take us to church, go work, pick us up, go work that night. He'd miss our birthday things. He'd just miss stuff working all the time. She said, I just have a hard time believing in this loving, caring, personal, heavenly Father when my dad has been so distant. Does this guy love his kids? Absolutely. But do you see why Moses is saying the very first thing when he's talking about the next generation is make God Lord of your life and Lord of your home. Not work, not money, not your profession, not a hobby. Make God the Lord of your life, period. You know, one of the best ways to do this, I think, is to look at our checkbooks, how we spend our money, and look at our calendar, how we spend our time. Because Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. But you know what I think kids really tune into, whether their mom, their dad, their uncle, their teacher, their grandparents, what they really value is when something goes bad. Like when a crisis hits, it's like kids have an antenna that goes, do-do-do-do-do. How are my mom and dad or my papa and my Grammy responding to this? Do they really believe it? Probably 10 years ago, I was speaking at this camp in Northern California. I was driving with a pastor that I didn't know, had never met him before, about a 6-hour drive. And in this area of California, you're in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of deserty, central, eastern California. And we're heading up there in the middle of nowhere. All of a sudden, it's the two of us in his car, and I hear this loud screeching noise coming from his car. My first thought is, man, why are we driving this old car? We should have left earlier. I'm thinking, God, I'm going to speak in evangelism for you. Are you really going to let us get abandoned here? How are we going to get out of this? All the wrong things are going through my mind. We pull over and the pastor stops and he says, let's pray. I see problems as opportunities to trust God. I sat there and thought, compared to this man, I'm a spiritual raisin. Maybe even a grape nut. I don't remember almost anything else we talk about that whole time. I don't even remember this pastor's name, sadly enough, but I will not forget that because that told me he is not in it for anything else, but he wants to serve God, and God truly is Lord of his life. And then Moses goes on. It says in verse 5, he says, love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. In other words, love God with what? Love God with everything. Love God with everything. You know why I think this is important? Because kids will tend to follow the passion of their parents or significant adults in their life. What you get excited about, the kids, your grandkids, the young people they interact with will tend to get excited about those things. My son is 9, and when he was 6, I was driving him to school. And I said to my son, hey, Scotty, what do you love? And he goes, well, Dad, in football, I love the Chargers. I said, okay, Scotty, what else do you love? He said, in basketball, I love the Lakers. I said, okay, Scotty, what else do you love? He said, in baseball, I love the Red Sox, and I hate the Yankees. Now, the strange thing when he gave 3 sport answers is that in our family, we actually hate sports. Yeah, you don't believe that, do you? Why did he say he loves the Chargers? Well, actually, my wife got me into football. Her dad was a high school coach for years, and growing up, Sunday time, they'd watch the football games as a family. Fun family ritual they would do. Why did my son say he loved basketball? Actually, because I played 4 years of college basketball at Biola University, and I know what you're thinking. But you're short and you're white, which proves only one thing: there must be a God. My wife was actually a college point guard. I love the game of basketball. Why did my son say he loves the Red Sox and hates the Yankees? Because my mom, his Grammy, is from Boston, and she loves the Red Sox so much, she got one of those mini cars, red and white, to reflect the colors of the Red Sox. In fact, if the Red Sox aren't playing, my mom is checking the scores just to make sure the Yankees lose. Now, I never had to sit my son down and say, Scotty, you are a McDowell. That means you love the Chargers. Scotty, you're a McDowell. You love the Lakers, you love the Red Sox, and you hate the Yankees. I didn't have to tell him that. How did he learn that? Because he saw us talk about things. He saw us get excited about things and just kind of learned, because of the important people in his life, that those things matter, and he started to invest himself in it. My son doesn't even play baseball. And just this week he said to me, of all the sports, I just love to watch the Red Sox with Grammy because she just loves it so much. Kids tend to follow the passion of their parents or significant adults. So what do you get excited about? What are the things when the topic comes up that you kind of lean in and you talk faster and you get motivated by it? Because what you get motivated by will tend to motivate the young people that you interact with. And on the flip side, what breaks your heart? Because what breaks your heart and moves you to tears will tend to similarly move the emotions of the young people you work with and you know. But then Moses goes on in verse 6. He says, these words I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Notice, he's given them commandments, he's given them statutes, but they're to be in the heart. If there's anything that turns a generation away from God more, I don't think there's anything more than legalism within the church. When it's about rules, it's about commandments, about doing things, and it's not about a relationship, it's not about passion, it turns young people off. See, I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but in the university, there's 2 to 3 times as many atheists and agnostics than there is in the public as a whole. I got tired of teaching my students in a Christian high school the biblical worldview. And then they go to the university, and then a professor would directly or indirectly just unravel everything I had been pouring into my students. So I got together with a buddy of mine named Brett Kunkel, who had done trips like this, and I said, we need to take our students to the most godless, secular place we can think of. Bring in atheists, bring agnostics, let them speak to our students, but we're going to train our students how to ask good questions and see right through that worldview. So just this past week, I got back from taking 22 high school students to Berkeley. We brought in some atheists. We brought in a gay homosexual activist. We brought in a few skeptics to talk to our students, and our students saw right through it. But time and time again, when I get to interact with skeptics and atheists like this, I say, I'm curious, just tell me your story. Why are you an atheist? And what I hear over and over and over again was I grew up in church. There are a bunch of rules. Do this, don't do that, but I never saw the reason for it, and it was never in my heart. In fact, something similar to this happened to one of the most famous artists of all time, Vincent van Gogh. You know, Vincent van Gogh grew up wanting to be a pastor. He wanted to be a pastor. In fact, this is a self-portrait he did of himself. He wanted to be a pastor. But he couldn't because he couldn't master Greek. But they allowed him to become a missionary. By all records we have, and you can get books of the letters of Vincent van Gogh that are fascinating, he was seeing people come to Christ. He kind of was the kind of person, he'd go where people were. I'd give him the shoes off his feet, the shirt off his back. He'd sleep outside with the blue-collar folks, the way it was described. But then he went up before the mission board to have his license renewed. And Vincent van Gogh was denied being a missionary for 2 reasons. Number 1, they said, Vincent, you're not a good enough preacher. Number 2, your appearance is unbecoming of a minister of God. Obviously, they hadn't read the story of John the Baptist. So for 6 months, there's silence within his life, and then letters start to crop up about him wanting to be an artist. Well, do you know, he sold 1 painting in his life for very little to a family member, died essentially thinking that he was a failure, at least during his lifetime. Now his paintings go for millions. You know how much I had to pay? No, I'm just kidding. I don't have Van Gogh. I got a Van Gogh ripoff I got down in Mexico. That's the closest thing I have. But what Van Gogh would do is, the secular story is that he got burned by the church and left his faith. I don't think that's true. But what he did do is he used his art to show that God was displayed in nature, but that the church is dead. So this painting, A Starry Night, which everybody recognizes, one of the most famous paintings in the world that you'll see coming up here, Starry Night. If you look up in the top, can you throw it up there for me? Now, the painting of the Starry Night, if you look up in the sky, here's what you'll notice. Remember how the sky is moving and it's active and it's alive? Can you picture this? Because Vincent van Gogh believed that the skies proclaim the glory of God. Day by day they spew forth knowledge. Night by night they display speech. He believed the heavens and the natural world revealed truth about God. But if you remember in the painting, if you look down into the valley, does anyone remember what's at the center of the painting in the valley? Someone said it, a church. But if you look at the church, you know what you will notice? The lights are off because the church is dead. Even Van Gogh saw that if we miss the heart and the reason and the passion for why we do this, it's going to turn people away. So Moses says there's commandments, there's truths, and there's statutes we follow, but these are to be in our heart. And I think that's exactly what Walker was talking about the first night. Why don't people evangelize? There it is. There must be a God. Why don't people evangelize? Because it's not in their hearts. It's not ultimately in their hearts. Well, verse 7 says this. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. In other words, talk about God when? All the time. In fact, the way I put it is make God part of the rhythm of life in your home. Make God part of the rhythm of life in your home. See, what happens, we live in a culture that says we are to compartmentalize our faith from our everyday lives. So faith is fine at Sunday school and church. Faith is fine on Bible study Wednesday night. Faith is fine when you go on a mission project. But your faith is not to really go outside of the walls of the church and affect how I think about politics or history or government or entertainment or culture. We do this without even realizing it. Yet the irony is, Abraham Kuyper, the great Dutch philosopher and politician, said, there is not a square inch of creation out of which God does not cry out, it's mine. But see, here's a subtle way we do this. I don't think there's a better school than Biola University where I teach that teaches students how to think biblically about every discipline. I think they're doing a fantastic job. But I remember something we did as an undergrad that subtly, well, here's what we would do. We would have chapel at the end of the year, like the last chapel. And there'd be 3,000 students there. And they would have the students stand who were going on mission trips to faraway places, going to China, going to Africa, going to India, going to Texas. They'd pray for those students, then there'd be worship, there'd be a message, and then it'd be done. I remember sitting there thinking, why are we only praying for the students going on a spiritual mission trip? How about the students going to be interns at IBM for the summer? Isn't that a mission field? But what we do without realizing it is we say we have our spiritual things over here and we have our secular things over here. I was speaking at another church in town here, Albuquerque, last spring about May, and I met two guys in their 30s who were mechanical engineers, grew up in the church. I said, I got a question for you. Can you tell me how you uniquely think about your profession as a Christian? They both looked at me and said, we've never thought about that question. I sat there and I thought, what a tragedy. They've heard Bible stories, they've heard Christian truth, but nobody has helped them to make that truth and translate it into their everyday life. That's why Moses is saying, talk about God all the time. You see, there was a study by Christian Smith, a sociologist at the University of Notre Dame, in a book called Souls in Transition. And he said, the way we develop religious beliefs is the same as in other areas. So the way someone develops political beliefs or historical beliefs or beliefs about culture, it's the same process by which you develop beliefs about religion. There's not a special way that we develop religious beliefs that's different from other beliefs. We have a common way we develop beliefs about the world. So why is it that kids who grow up in a conservative political home tend to be conservative politically? Those who grow up in a liberal home tend to be liberal politically. Why is that the case? We'll take the conservative home on the right. Maybe in the background on they have Fox News. Take the one on the left. Maybe in the background they have on MSNBC News, if you can call that news. Now think about it. How do these people tend to develop the convictions when it comes politically? Because the news is on, they talk about it at dinner, they're driving in the car, they talk about it. It's a process of conversation they just learn to think as their parents do, or significant adults in their lives. I doubt conservative or liberal parents sit down with their kids and say, all right, here's what we think about taxes, here's what we think about the marriage issue, here's what we think about foreign policy. They don't do that formally. The kids just kind of naturally pick it up because it's a part of the rhythm of life. Well, think about something that's important to you. Maybe you love to golf, right? You have a rule in your family that says, we talk about golf Saturday morning and Tuesday nights. No, if you love golf, when do you talk about it? All the time, because you love it. The question is, in your family, when do you talk about God? Because if we talk about God Sunday morning and Wednesday night, we are sending the message to the next generation that God is to be compartmentalized to Sunday and Wednesday night, but doesn't affect my real everyday life and the decisions I make. I work with young people, and it is a tragedy that very few have any idea how their beliefs in God and what they learn in church actually translates to the way that they live. So Moses actually gives us specifics. He says, talk about them when you sit in your home. Talk about them when you sit in your home. In other words, talk about them over the family meal. There was an article in Time, one that you could use and preach from. Just Google the magic of the family meal. I'm sorry, it was in Newsweek in 2006. And they started off and they said this. They said, a surprising trend is coming back. More families are sitting down having regular meals because the statistics are clear. Kids who dine with the folks are less likely to get into trouble, risky behavior, and more likely to have a positive self-image and do well in life. And they said, why is this the case? They said, because it's something about the family meal where stories are told, jokes are laughed at, and the wider world is viewed through the lens of the family's values. They said even on days when the food is cheap and the talk is fast, or the talk is cheap anyways, they said it instills a sense of identity in young people and tells them they're a part of something bigger than themselves when we live in a culture that says it's all just about the individual and how you feel. I mean, fascinating. The question is, do you carve out time with young people, with your kids, with your grandkids, just to relate and just to be together? The busiest year of my life. My wife was pregnant. We were moving. I was working on my master's degree at night, and I had my full first teaching job all in the same year. And I was doing some speaking on top of that. So we'd sit down for the family meal. I'd tell my wife, I was like, man, let's have the news on. I don't even know what's going on in the world. And then it started to hit me. I thought, what am I doing? I'm supposed to be setting the pace for my family. I'm not carving out this sacred time. So we turn it off. We sit down at the family meal. We turn the cell phone and we turn the TV off. Unless the Red Sox are playing, you don't want to be legalistic, right? But my question is, do you carve out that time and just be? Because young people today are connected to the internet somewhere between 7 and 11 hours a day interacting with digital media. 7 and 11 hours a day. What they need is human presence and listening and caring, and face-to-face brings healing to this generation. Brings healing to this generation. Then he says, talk about them when you walk along the road. So in other words, talk about them when you travel. Now my thinking is I'm going to get in the car and I'm going to either drive to get us there as fast as possible, or my wife drives so I can check my email and get something done. That's how I roll in terms of my mind. And there's sometimes you have to do that. But I started to realize this and realize, gosh, there's a natural opportunity when just walking somewhere or driving or flying to connect with kids or connect with grandkids. So I came up with this game in my family. I just call it the question game. And we'd ask our kids questions. We might ask them questions about math, science, history, and also Bible questions. Why would I do that? Because I want them to realize there's true answers in math, there's knowledge in science, and there's truth when it comes to religion and faith. I want them to see that these are all areas of knowledge. So when I started, my daughter was only 3, so every question I asked her basically had to be Jesus. Shauna, who died on the cross? Daddy, I know, Jesus. Shauna, who's born a virgin? Daddy, I know, Jesus. So I decided to mix it up. I said, Shauna, where do we go when we die? This 3-year-old looked me right back in the eyes. She said, jail. I think she might be Catholic. Don't get offended. My Catholic friends actually think that's funny when I tell them that. But do you use that time to build relationships and listen and have conversations? Then he says, talk about them when you lie down. Something about the end of a day of a young person's heart is just receptive and it's open. Now, are there times where I'm like, kids, go to sleep, I'm exhausted, and I want to spend time with my wife, or I want to go to bed myself? Sure. I started to realize I was missing this opportunity to just connect with and nurture my kids. So one thing I do, and I'd invite you to do this with the young people you work with. I'll say this to my kids all the time. I'll say, Shauna, Scotty, you can ask your dad anything. Nothing is off limits. I meet so many skeptics and non-believers, and they say, I had questions, and they shot me down and didn't take my questions seriously. The college transition project from Fuller Theological Seminary said one of the things we have to do to help young people transition in their faith is just give them room to doubt, give them room to ask questions. Because we freak out when there's doubt. So I say to my kids all the time, you can ask me anything. My son one day, he was 7, he goes, okay, Dad, who's Jesus praying to in the garden? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, Jesus is God, right? I said, yes. But he was praying to God, right? I said, yes. The 7-year-old looked at me. He said, was Jesus praying to himself? I said, go ask your mom. Do you know there was a study out just this past year on belief, and they argued that kids develop most of their core beliefs by the time they are 8 years old. 8 years old. I had a mom come to me, this is 2 years ago now. Her daughter was in 2nd grade, and I was at school. She goes, Mr. McDowell, help me. I got a question. I don't know how to answer it. And she was kind of like frantic. I said, well, it's okay. Calm down. Take a deep breath. What's the question? She said, my 6-year-old daughter asked me, did God love Osama bin Laden? I said, oh, that's easy. Here's what you say. And she leans in. I said, you say, what do you think? A question is almost always better than an answer. Jesus asked a lot of questions, and he knew the answer to draw it out of people. I don't want young people to believe things just because Daddy or Mr. McDowell said it. That's an appeal to authority. I want them to learn to believe stuff because it's actually true. If you ask a question back, what happens? It develops relationships. You start a dialogue. You also get insight into what people are thinking. I spent a lot of time answering the wrong question that people weren't even asking. Questions are almost always better than answers. When you work with young people, ask them questions, not to trap them, not to prove them wrong, just to understand and help them come to a knowledge of truth themselves. And then the last one he says, when you get up. There's something about the morning, right, that sets the pace for the day. I used to not have class for a couple years until about 10:30 or 11. So I would go to a coffee shop for a while, and I would study, write, research, grade papers for 3 or 4 hours in the morning. And one morning I was there, I saw a 16-year-old kid and his grandfather sitting there. The Bible was open. And they're reading the story of the Good Samaritan. Came back the next Wednesday, grandfather, grandson, Bible was open. I heard him talking something about finances and investing his money. Came back the next week, grandfather, grandson, Bible was open. And he's sitting there talking about like relationships and marriage and his future. I sat there and I thought, oh my goodness. Every Wednesday before school, this grandfather is taking his grandson, spending $5 on a coffee and donut. Actually, it was Starbucks, $8. And just pouring his life into this young person. Fast forward, this went on and on. It was in May, at the end of the school. I heard him get up and he said to his grandson, he goes, well, it's summertime, schedule's going to change. Do you want to pick up back in the fall or do you want to try to keep going through summer? And he goes, well, Grandpa, if we can, I'd love to keep doing this through the summer. I really enjoy it. I sat there and I thought, I was so impressed upon this. I started to think, gosh, what if every kid in my classroom had a grandfather who poured into him like this? How different would my classroom be? How different would my church be? How different would my state be? California would not be bankrupt if every grandfather just taught basic biblical principles about money to their grandkids. We wouldn't be. We wouldn't be. So I sent out a tweet. I'm on Twitter, and it copies to my Facebook page. And I don't remember the words I used, but something to the effect of, watching this grandfather week after week buy his grandson coffee and a donut and pour his life into him and mentor him. And then the comments started pouring in. You know what one of the most common comments was? People said this, I wish I had a grandfather like that. One of the biggest lies from Satan is that this generation does not need adults, a mom, and dad, an uncle, a teacher, a grandparent, to reach in and calm the beloved and care for him. That's a lie from the pit of hell. I work with young people, and I can tell you the heart of a young person is to be called the beloved. That's the heart, and that's exactly what Pastor Walker was talking about. They might fight it, they might resist it, they might act like they don't, but every young person I've ever known wants somebody to be proud of them, wants somebody to care about them, wants somebody to come beside them and say, I will just use the things God has given me to help you be everything God has designed you to be. I want to tell you about somebody I met who's a hero of mine, and it's not Tim Tebow. Now, God bless Tim Tebow. I totally respect and admire what he's doing, but it's amazing to me as Christians. We get an NFL quarterback and all Christians get giddy like, oh, we're in with culture. We've arrived. We do. I'll tell you about someone who's more of a hero to me. This is a lady who taught Bible at a Christian school for years, but she started to get cancer and she was dying and she couldn't do it anymore. So the last few months of her life, she took 2 students to coffee once a week and just read worldview or theology or apologetics books, poured her life into these students. I met these 2 students one time. They said she had already passed away, but we already knew everything you said to my talk because this lady poured into us and taught us that. I thought, my goodness, what if everybody in the church had a vision to just get one young person and grab them and just help them be everything God designed them to be? that would echo for generations. Amen? I don't know. I've enjoyed being here and get a chance to meet you, hear about your ministries, everything God is doing through you. And some of you have different interests and different abilities. But let me tell you something. Young people are facing more challenges than any generation, period. It is all hands on deck. Whether it's our kids, grandkids, those of us in our community, we've got to find some young people, follow what the scriptures talk about, and help them be everything God helped them to be. And I think when that happens, when we're at the end of our life and we look back, we'll be able to say, man, I did everything I could, and have a sense of just pleasure that we've helped a young person be everything God helped them to be. Amen? If you want to help young people, the first thing you got to do is pick up Walker's book. I got a copy right here, Rite of Passage Parenting. 4 Essential Experiences to Equip Your Kids for Life. What a great resource this is. Can't wait till my kids are old enough. I'm going to want to send them to that rite of passage that you were talking about. And then one my dad and I wrote together called The Unshakable Truth. Kind of 2 generations looking in together saying, how do we reach this new generation? And we lay out the essentials that we should die on as Christians. It's not the age of the earth. It's not the role of women in church. It's salvation by faith, the character of Jesus, the scriptures. And then how we know they're true, but how we actually live them out in relationships. Usually it's theology or relationships. We did theology and show how it applied to relationships. That was our goal. So I pray that if you care about the next generation, that would be a resource that could help you guys. I'm going to sneak back to my table. I have a flight because I got the earliest flight out so I could get back and be with my own kids. You guys have been absolutely fantastic. I'm thrilled to meet many of you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your conference. God bless.